that certain intensity. So we're going to look at a couple of different sporting situations, a couple of different Hello, welcome to today's group class. We're going to be looking at some A-level content today, more specifically energy systems. Now, in last lesson we took a look at the ATP stores, the ATP PC system, the lactic acid system, and then the aerobic system, working through different stages of energy production, going through glycolysis, both anaerobic and aerobic. Then we went to look at the Krebs cycle, and then we finished off with the electron transport chain, I should say, and beta oxidation as well, utilising those free fatty acids. Where we're going to take it now is the utilisation of different systems in different muscles and in different sporting contexts. So we're going to go through it and take a real look at what intensities each system can be availed of and provides the predominant amount of energy at that certain intensity. So we're going to look at a couple of different sporting situations, a couple of different muscle fibre types, and we're going to see which sort of relationship between fibre type and sporting context, what energy system they rely on most. And then at the end of this session, we will be taking a look at EPOC, the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, so EPOC. So we're going to get straight into it, and starting off with we're going to be able to identify the differences in ATP production between the types of muscle fibres. And before we go sort of into the detailed parts of this section, what we have to think about first is how fibre types look differently. Not necessarily under a microscope, but in a performance. So how do they function differently? So when we are analysing the use of energy systems in sporting contexts, we have to remember that each fibre type is built differently. It's got different structural characteristics, and because of those structural characteristics, they have certain functionalities. They can actually produce certain outcomes. Now, a slow twitch muscle fibre is not going to be great at explosive sporting events and contractions because it hasn't got the properties to allow it to be that way. It's got different properties, but the properties that a slow twitch muscle does have allows it to operate for a longer period of time at a lower intensity. So it's not just this magical explanation as to why different muscle or why people are built in a certain way and why certain sports performers are suited to different events. There's structural differences, fundamental differences between each type of muscle fibre, which lends itself to the production of energy in a certain way. And that production of energy can then determine what sporting contexts it's best suited to. And it brings in the argument of nature versus nurture. Are we born a successful sports performer? Or maybe not born a successful sports performer, but are we born with the tools which we can then refine to become one of the best? Or is it up to us? Can we choose any sport, any intensity, any context, and get good at it through training? Well, the answer is probably somewhere in between, but what we're going to be looking at today is more towards that nature side, that natural ability of muscle fibre type that you inherit. Okay, so just to remind you, we do have these three muscle fibre types: our slow twitch, our fast twitch oxidative, and then fast twitch glycolytic. And as you can see from that arrow there, we've got this increase in fatigue rate as we see this increase in contractibility. Okay, so just to go into a bit more detail of the specific structures and functions. If I just move myself up a little bit there, put myself over here, that'll be easier. So just to remind us, we've got structural characteristics and then functional characteristics. So if we start with structures, that's what we could see. If we actually took the muscle apart and we looked at it under a microscope, what could we see? Well, we've got capillaries, we've got fibre size, the amount of myoglobin inside of that muscle. We've got glycogen space for phosphocreatine, space for triglycerides. You know, remember all of those fuels that we broke down, where we had our phosphocreatine, we had our glycogen, and we had our free fatty acids, all three of which get funneled in to energy systems, possibly anaerobic, maybe aerobic. But it's these three fuel systems, I'll make myself larger. It's these three fuel sources, phosphocreatine, glycogen, free fatty acids. We funnel them into anaerobic or aerobic capabilities, with glycogen being able to utilise both sides. Free fatty acids being broken down aerobically, phosphocreatine being broken down anaerobically. Glycogen can work in both camps. But we need space inside of our muscles to store phosphocreatine, glycogen and free fatty acids. And we can see that space. That's a structural characteristic of a muscle fibre type. So just through that alone, if we can see more storage space for phosphocreatine, then it stands to reason that the function of that muscle is going to be better suited to anaerobic processes, anaerobic events, quick, powerful, short-lasting. Why? Because it's got the fuel source readily available. It hasn't got the fuel sources, or not a lot of them, which can be broken down aerobically. Therefore, it doesn't operate aerobically as often. So, we know that we've got storage spaces, we've got things like capillaries, fibre size, mitochondrial density there. Mitochondria, we should be thinking back to the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain. That was the site, the place in which aerobic respiration takes place. So we can almost add that. In fact, go back to the whiteboard. We could add the mitochondria into the mix over here. If we've got mitochondria, if I just put mito, if we've actually got mitochondria and we've got high storage of free fatty acids and we've got lots of aerobic enzymes, well, we've got this fantastic cocktail of all the right facilities and spaces and ingredients to create a lot, we've got plus sign, of aerobic energy. If we are lacking in any one of those three, then chances are we're not going to be dealing with a slow, oxidative muscle fibre. It's probably going to be something more like the one in the middle, a fast oxidative, where we've got best of both worlds. Right, so what you can see on the right-hand side of the screen then is the differences. I know that we've recapped these before, we've gone over these before, but just to recap them now. If we take a look at just the words that have been used, high, medium, low, small, medium, large, it's easier to remember the differences between these fibre types if we just think of this table, or any table. You know, if you've written it down and you've got different colours, different words, different phrases, you know, that's brilliant. But to put it all in one place where we have this comparison side by side, so we take the characteristic, for example, phosphocreatine storage space, and then we come across this table. Well, slow oxidative muscle fibres have small amounts of PC storage space, whereas type 2 fast glycolytic have large phosphocreatine storage space. How does that affect our function? How does it affect our performance? Well, if we haven't got as much phosphocreatine, then we're not going to be exercised anaerobically. If we've got lots of phosphocreatine space, then we can replenish the stores to a large volume and we can break them down for a little bit longer. How's that going to look? What's the functional characteristic going to be as a result of that? Well, anaerobic capabilities. Look at that. Slow oxidative muscle fibres have low anaerobic capabilities and they have small phosphocreatine storage space. They go hand in hand. But if we look at the other side, the fast glycolytic muscle fibres that fast twitch, they've got large phosphocreatine storage space, therefore they've got high anaerobic capabilities. They're going to be suited to the sports and contexts and events that demand anaerobic energy, instantly, high amounts, speed, power. Okay, so if we take a little sort of more specific look now at each fibre type in a sporting situation. So slow twitch muscle fibres, they use the aerobic system to produce their ATP, because let's not forget, yes, we've got PC, glycogen, free fatty acids, yes, we've got anaerobic and aerobic systems, but what's the point of all of it? ATP, the currency of our body, adenosine triphosphate. We can just use multiple pathways of chemical reactions in order to put an ADP back to an P to create an ATP. That's the crux of it. That's what we need. We've just got these three different ways of doing it. Now the slow twitch fibres, these use the aerobic system. So they've got this constant delivery of oxygen. Why? Because we've got high amounts of capillaries. We've got large quantities of myoglobin inside the muscle, ready to collect the oxygen from the blood vessel, the capillary, to bring that oxygen in, and we've got lots of mitochondria. So we've got a place to put the oxygen once the myoglobin has taken it out of the blood. How does this look? Well, the aerobic pathway, yes, it's complex. So it's going to take time to access it fully when we start to exercise. Or not so much when we start to exercise, because right now, you and I are most likely using predominantly aerobic energy pathways. We've got a surplus of oxygen coming in relation to the energy demands of our body. So if we were to suddenly go for a brisk walk or a jog or a cycle or a swim or whatever for 20, 30 minutes, demands go up, but we can also match those demands with a surplus of oxygen. But it's going to take time. We're going to look at that in a moment about when these different energy systems take over from one another. So slow twitch fibres. We're looking at sport that takes a little bit of time to find the rhythm, or it lasts longer than just a couple of minutes. It can't be too high intensity, because the harder we work, we're going to miss out on that oxygen surplus. We're not going to have enough to actually break down glycogen and free fatty acids because there isn't enough oxygen. So long duration, moderate intensity exercise. You should have a couple of examples inside your head. That picture there on the right hand side, it's when thinking about muscle fibre types, they do take on two different colours. So one looks a little bit whiter, one looks a little bit redder. The reason for the red is this density of sort of mitochondria and the aerobic enzymes and structures that we've just been talking about. They take on a more red image. So like you can see there, a fibre that's darker in its colour, that's more red compared to another one, that's going to be slower twitch because it's got more of these structures linked to slow twitch fibres, but they take on this red colour. So sometimes in your exam, depending on the specific exam that you're sitting, you might need to be able to talk about the different characteristics. One of which, slow twitch is redder, fast twitch is whiter. A way to think about it is if you've ever cooked chicken breast or a piece of steak perhaps, or beef, think about the speed a chicken moves and a cow moves. A cow is very slow, a steak is red. A chicken is very quick and it flaps rapidly. That's fast twitch, it's white meat, white versus red. Fast twitch fibres. So these, set that away. So fast twitch fibres, alactic and lactic energy. Now alactic is our first stage using phosphocreatine, where we can produce ATP and we're not producing lactic acid. So alactic, the absence of lactic acid production. Lactic energy is when we produce ATP, but lactic acid is, unfortunately, a byproduct. So fast twitch fibres, they have the structures that equip us to release energy using the alactic and lactic system. But they're not very good at doing what the slow twitch fibres can. They're not very good at using aerobic energy pathways. They're not great at eliciting energy from Krebs cycle, from the electron transport chain. Why? Because it hasn't got many mitochondria, or it's got fewer mitochondria than, say, the slow twitch fibres. It's an important thing to remember, whenever we're comparing slow and fast twitch fibres, always compare them in relation to each other. So if we are to look at yields now, we know that the ATP-PC system has a yield of 1. So 1 phosphocreatine broken down leads to the production of 1 ATP at the end. But if we can break down a glycogen anaerobically, we can get 2 ATP. If we can break down a glycogen or free fatty acids aerobically and more completely, we can get 34 to 38 ATP. So how does this look different in sport? How does this determine the intensity at which we can operate? Well, fast twitch fibres, it's not like there isn't a lower energy demand. They just need to burn through their fuels faster and convert it at higher rates to produce the same amount of energy. We need to break down 34 phosphocreatine to get 34 ATP. Or, in a slow twitch fibre, we could break down 1 glycogen a little bit slower with more oxygen and get 34 ATP. We're going to have far more glycogen left over than we are phosphocreatine. And that's where fatigue comes in, just down at the bottom there. This early onset of fatigue occurs in fast twitch fibres when we perform at high intensity. Their output is greater than a slow twitch fibre, but shorter lasting. A slow twitch fibre takes longer to get going. It can't operate at the same level of intensity, but it can do 70 to 80% of that for far longer, hours longer. Why? Because of the structures, therefore the functions. They are different. So, I'm not going to stop now, but if you are watching this on repeat in the portal or within a group class, then by all means pause this, look through the slides again, and give yourself a bit of a test or a challenge and try and answer those 4 questions there. We're going to move on, but feel free to pause it now and go back through those 4 questions there. So, moving on, learning objective 4 in this whole energy system, unit we could call it. So, explaining oxygen consumption during and after exercise through the concepts of oxygen deficit and EPOC. So EPOC, that was that phrase I said at the very start. I think I got it wrong at the very start. It's excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. If we were to just break that down in a phrase, excessive post-exercise, so once exercise is finished, oxygen consumption. So when we finish exercising, we continue to consume an excess of oxygen. So why? Why do we consume it? Well, it's because of this thing called an oxygen deficit. Well, first of all, oxygen consumption is this utilisation of oxygen around the body. You've heard of the phrase VO2, or VO2 max is the thing that people test for with the multi-stage fitness test or sub-maximal forestry step test, things like that. Well, oxygen consumption is another way of saying what that VO2 max is. But the VO2 max is that upper limit. Okay, everywhere below that is the oxygen consumption. The VO2 max is our maximum oxygen consumption. And it's basically how much we can take in and use in our body. It's one thing to breathe a volume of air in. You should be thinking minute ventilation here, air in, air out per minute. But to then extract the oxygen out of that air volume from our lungs, to then pass it into the blood, to then pump enough blood around the body into enough capillaries close enough to our working muscles, which have enough myoglobin in, which have enough mitochondria in, so that we can actually use the oxygen that we breathed in from the air which was outside of us. So there's so many different components that lead to our oxygen consumption capabilities. Now, the oxygen deficit is when we're consuming, no, wrong word. It's when we're using oxygen to convert foods into ATP. It's when we're doing that at a rate that outweighs what's currently coming in and being passed around our body. We're in this state of negative. So if we were to look at it in just some raw numbers, and it's not like these numbers aren't, don't quote me on these numbers, I'm just making them up. But imagine if we were at rest and there we go. So our oxygen consumption, our OC, the amount of oxygen we're currently breathing in, extracting, delivering, extracting again and using in the muscles is, let's just say, 10. That's how many oxygen molecules we're bringing in per second. Oxygen consumption, okay, at rest, so if I say, no, mix this up, oxygen delivery, let's call it. So oxygen delivery and oxygen consumption on this side. So my body is currently breathing in and delivering 10 oxygen delivery. My oxygen consumption inside the muscle and around the working body is also 10. So at the moment, these are balanced. That's okay. I can work aerobically, there's no lactic acid being produced, I have enough ATP to function properly, this is all looking good. But when I start to exercise, I'll put it over here. If I were to start exercising, to start with, my oxygen delivery will probably stay the same. I'm talking about the first 5, 10, 15 seconds of exercise. But my oxygen consumption, my muscles are contracting. They need ATP now. In the next 10 seconds, they need it right here, right now. So my oxygen consumption has just spiked to 25 oxygen molecules per second are currently being used. Well, that's not good, because now I'm in this state of imbalance. 10 isn't going to cut it, because I'm using 25 a second and I'm only delivering 10 a second. So what do I need to do? I need to increase the amount of oxygen that I start to bring into my body. But I can't do that straight away. There's going to be a lag. So it might go up to 15, then it might go up to 20, then finally it might make it to 25, and we're balanced out again. So this time delay, this lag, this gap in how much oxygen I'm bringing in and how much I'm consuming, that's what we call our oxygen deficit. It's this lack of, this negative amount of oxygen that's currently being circulated in our body compared with how much we actually need inside of our muscle. Okay, that third point there, I sort of touched on that before. Don't confuse this with volume of air being breathed in. It's not your minute ventilation. That's the first part. We breathe air in, then we extract the oxygen at the alveoli. We then get it to the pump, the heart, to then deliver it through arteries, arterioles, capillaries, to the working muscles, for the myoglobin to then, extract the oxygen from the passing blood, for it to then be used inside the muscle, oxygen consumption. And when we start to exercise, that's that last point there. When we start to exercise, this oxygen consumption, this oxygen demand, it can go as high as 6 litres. Whereas up at the top there, 0.3. So I'm giving you these numbers of 10 and 25. You could substitute that for 0.3 litres here and 6 litres over here. That's the jump that we might need to make in our oxygen capture, delivery, extraction, and then consumption. So how does this look on a graph? Because you've probably seen this in your studies already, and you'll definitely need to be able to annotate it or describe it because it could come up in your exam and you might be asked to use your data analysis tools. So we're quickly going to go through this. Now, deficit is this mint, I'm going to say, mint colour. It's not quite green, not quite blue, but that mint coloured zone, that's your deficit. That's what we were just talking about. How oxygen consumption begins to increase. Okay, that upward arrow is going up and it gradually gets up to the top or the point at which it levels off. Now, until it does reach that point and level off and we're now in the groove, we're now balanced out, we're plateaued, we've got that exercise balance. We're consuming as much as we're using. That's when the deficit has technically stopped. But you're probably thinking there's a blue section over there as well. And that is called our oxygen debt. And we're going to get to that in a second. But during these initial stages, just that first point there, how do we actually increase? How do we get this line to start going up? Well, it's the changes in our circulatory system. It's the changes in the mitochondrial uptake of oxygen. This lag time that I was just describing, we need this time for our different receptors inside of our body, chemoreceptors, baroreceptors, proprioceptors, thermoreceptors. They're detecting changes, passing messages to the brain. The brain then signals to the respiratory control centre to start increasing our tidal volume, to start using our expiratory and inspiratory reserve volumes either side of our tidal volume so that we can breathe deeper and more frequently so that we can increase minute ventilation. The cardiac control centre is being called on as well to start contracting the heart faster. We've got venous return mechanisms increasing in their activity, atrial suction, gravity, skeletal muscle pump because we're starting to move. All of these factors start to contribute to delivering more oxygen to the working muscles, to try and reduce the deficit that we're currently in. Now, even at this point here, yes, we are in the groove, or we've matched the current levels of demand. That doesn't automatically make up for the lost time. And that's what this oxygen debt is, and we're going to go over that in a second. Those last 2 points there, especially that black one, the higher the intensity of exercise and the less developed the cardiovascular system, the larger this deficit will be. Everything I just said there, receptors, respiratory control centre, minute ventilation, cardiac control centre. If you're a trained performer, those systems are going to be in good shape. They're going to be able to respond quickly. They're going to be able to change a lot to be able to respond to these oxygen demands. If we're untrained, the cardiac system isn't going to be as responsive. The uptake of oxygen isn't going to be as effective. The delivery of blood around the body, vascular shunt mechanisms, aren't going to be as effective. The net result of all of that is an untrained performer will take longer to reach this in the groove state. We're going to see a shallower curve and it will take longer to actually meet the demands, if we meet the demands at all. Now, who's to say that if we've got our two performers, so this here being O2 consumption and this being our time, sorry, this is also exercise intensity up this side as well. So exercise, rest, boom. Exercise starts and we go for a constant run at a constant pace. We then stop and we rest again. Now for the trained performer, they'll be able to increase their oxygen intake, they'll plateau, and then they'll rest. An untrained performer, now this could be the, there it is. For an untrained performer, they might take longer to respond in the first place, they're going to have a shallower curve, and they might not actually be able to meet the demands by the time exercise finishes. And they're going to take longer to recover. Because their body's not as responsive, they don't end up getting in as much oxygen as quickly in order to reach this plateaued level, this in the groove state. And this could be a 30-minute exercise session, could be a 20-minute exercise session, doesn't really matter. But that's that difference between trained and untrained. Right, we shall move on. I'm going to move on to sort of this second section now, this dark green section, the oxygen debt. Because it's to do with this word up here, up in the top corner, recovery. Because like we've just been talking about with this deficit, we're taking time. Down here we've got minutes. We've taken about 5 to 6 minutes to actually hit this in the groove state, to actually match oxygen consumption and oxygen demand. Well, if you were to think about this in terms of money or finances, if you spend, and this was days along the bottom, on day 1 you spend 40 but you only earn 25. Okay, you're £15 short. Day 2 you spend 40 but you only earn 30. You're £10 short. 15 plus 10, well, you're now £25 in debt. The next day, day 3, you spend 40 but only earn 35. That's another £5 deficit. 25 plus 5, you're now £30 in debt. And this goes on and on and on and on until eventually day 6, you spend 40 and you earn 40. So now the debt stops growing, but you've still got that debt to pay back. You're still 45, £50 overdrawn in your overdraft. Just because you're now matched, it doesn't mean that you're out of the woods yet. So that's what this oxygen debt is here. It's how much we owe our body, how much oxygen we owe it back to reset it to what it was before exercise, before all of this deficit and exercise happened. So an essential component is to restore oxygen levels around the body that may have been impacted by this oxygen consumption. This whole movement, this increased intensity has stripped our body of its oxygen stores. And it's taken us time to get it back. So we need to pay this deficit back. We pay it back, and the volume that we give it back, that's called the oxygen debt. So it's the volume of air that we continue to consume after exercise. So if we go back to the title of this whole section, really, excess, post-exercise, oxygen consumption. Well, we know what oxygen consumption is now. We know that it's this retrieval, delivery, and extraction of oxygen around our body. So we keep that process elevated beyond what we actually currently need due to exercise. So we keep that excess even after exercise is finished, so that we can pay off that oxygen debt. So how do we do that? We keep heart rate elevated. We keep breathing rate elevated. We make sure that we are carrying on, keeping oxygen in, or coming in, and being delivered at higher rates than resting, so that surplus oxygen can carry on being supplied around the body. And there's 2 stages, fast and slow. Fast happens first, think F for first, fast for first, and slow is the longer ones. And there are 3 things that you need to remember for each one, which is what we're going to look at now, and that's going to be our last thing. So the fast component, if we were to look at it on a grid or a table or a graph, it's this A section. It's this first initial part. It's about 3 minutes. So it lasts about 2 to 3 minutes, and if we were to look at it on a graph there, it's that steep slope down. So even on this graph that I drew behind me here, you can see it's this first section on both performers. This volume here. It's about 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. The way that I try and teach it and remember it, 3 things happen in 3 minutes, and it takes 3 litres of surplus oxygen. Say that again. 3 minutes, 3 things. 3 minutes, 3 things what was the last one? And 3 litres of oxygen. So, what are those 3 things? We've got the resynthesis of muscle ATP. We've got the replenishment of phosphocreatine stores. And we've got the resaturation of muscle myoglobin. Now, you might be able to see a bit of a link there between those 3. The link is to do with our energy systems. We're getting to the point that, not the point, we're resetting our energy systems. From the first one, the one that we use immediately, we reset that first. Our second go-to energy pathway, we reset that one second. And the third energy pathway that we go to, we reset that one third. In order to move, we need ATP. That first reaction, 1 to 2 seconds worth of breaking down ATP using ATPase to release energy for movement and converting it into ADP plus P. Our ATP. So what's the first thing that we do with this surplus, this excess of oxygen? Well, we use it to continue energy release in any other energy pathway. We continue to release energy so that we can stick ADP back to P to resynthesize ATP. So we've got this growing number of ATP and we shove it into our muscle stores for ATP, ready to be broken down the very second that we move again. First thing. Just like that equation or that word there. ADP plus P, it's an endothermic reaction. So why do we continue to consume this excess oxygen? So that we can keep other energy pathways working in the background. Anaerobic, aerobic, breaking down glycogen, breaking down free fatty acids. We carry on breaking those down even though we've stopped exercising. We break those foods down and release exothermic energy. Why? Because we need it to resynthesize ADP plus P. Because if we have any hope or any intention of exercising in the next 10 seconds, we will need fresh ATP ready to break down so that we can contract our muscles. So it's vital that in the first seconds and 2-3 minutes of recovery, we put back together the ATP inside of our muscle. Second, as we said, phosphocreatine. Because if we forget about EPOC for a second, if we just think about energy pathways, in the first 2 seconds we use ATP inside of our muscles. For the next 3 to 12 seconds of exercise, we use phosphocreatine, ATP-PC system. Well, if we've just been exercising at moderate to high intensity and we've broken down all of our phosphocreatine, we've stopped, we're resting, if we have any intention of exercising in the next 10-15 seconds again, it could be a second set in the gym. It could be running back to defence after our team has just broken forwards in a game of basketball. If we have any intention of moving again for longer than 1 or 2 seconds, we're going to need phosphocreatine. Because if we haven't got phosphocreatine, we can't use the ATP-PC system. So we carry on consuming oxygen. We carry on releasing energy from breaking down glycogen and free fatty acids. We release energy. Why? So that we can put phosphocreatine back together. P plus C is also an endothermic reaction, just like ADP plus P. You might be thinking anything with a plus sign is endothermic. Well, you're right in the context of sport and PE. ADP plus P, endothermic. It requires energy to put it back together. So we consume oxygen after exercise to release energy from foods to put them back together. P plus C, endothermic, requires energy. So we carry on consuming oxygen, break down glycogen and free fatty acids, release energy, exothermic energy, so that we can take that energy and put phosphocreatine back together so that we can use it again in 10 seconds time. Now this graph here, what you might be looking at, upward curve, and roughly speaking 3 minutes, shock, fast stage 2 to 3 minutes, phosphocreatine roughly takes 3 minutes to replenish between 90 and 100% of its stores. I'll say that again. It takes 3 minutes to replenish 90 to 100% of phosphocreatine stores. So in 3 minutes, we've broken down enough glycogen and fats because of the surplus and excess of oxygen. We've released enough exothermic energy in 3 minutes to put back together enough P plus C, P plus C, P plus C, P plus C. Suddenly, we've got 100% capacity of our phosphocreatine in 3 minutes. Incredible. Which is why, if you go to the gym or you play sports and it's a high intensity sport and you regularly do sprints perhaps, if you do work maximally to the point where you start to fatigue during the run or cycle or sprint or whatever it is, or in the gym, it might be that you get to rep number 15 or 16 and you fatigue, you exhaust. Give yourself 2 or 3 minutes and you could probably do that exact same exercise again. Give yourself 1 minute, you could probably do 60 to 70% of what you just did again. Well, have a look at the graph. If you gave yourself a minute, 60 seconds, follow the graph up, well, you've only got about 70% of your phosphocreatine ready to go again. Which is why, in the gym, let's say, first set, you got to 15 or 16 reps, gave yourself a minute off. Next time you gave it a go, you got 11 or 12. And then you fatigued, then you exhausted. Why? Because you didn't have enough phosphocreatine. Because you didn't allow enough time for recovery. And that's that last point there that we've just been talking about. 90% in about 2 minutes, 100% in 3 minutes. Rule of 3. 3 minutes, 3 things are done, and it takes 3 litres of excess oxygen. Last one then of the fast component, and then we'll talk about the slow component. So number 3, resaturation of muscle myoglobin. Well, myoglobin are these green blobs that I've put onto this image. Oxygen are in these discs, oxyhemoglobin. Myoglobin are there, they're not magnetised, but they attract oxygen across, out of the capillary and into the muscle. They've got a higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin. So why do we do this? What's the point? Well, would you rather have oxygen inside of a blood capillary, or would you rather have oxygen inside of your muscle before you're about to exercise? You'd rather have it inside the muscle, because then it's ready to go and you haven't got to waste time delivering oxygenated blood to the working muscle for it to then jump out and get into the muscle before we've even started using it. It makes sense for our body to deliver oxygen back to the muscle to resaturate the myoglobin, so that when we exercise next time, go back to what the 2 tables that I had on the board with the oxygen consumption and oxygen demand. We want to have the oxygen consumption, oxygen delivery high as soon as we can, and we want to be able to increase that number as quickly as we can when the oxygen demand goes up. What's one way that we can do that? We can resaturate muscle myoglobin at the end of exercise, so that when we do begin exercise next time, we've got oxygen ready and waiting inside the muscle to jump straight into the mitochondria and to release energy aerobically. And we don't need to be producing lactic acid. We don't have to deplete phosphocreatine. We can enter efficient aerobic energy pathways quicker if we can resaturate muscle myoglobin with oxygen. I'll leave those points up on the screen there for a second. But it's in this fast stage, 3 minutes, 3 things, 3 litres of oxygen. First we put back ATP. Then we put back together phosphocreatine. And then any surplus oxygen still travelling around carries on jumping out of that blood vessel into the muscle and attaching onto the myoglobin. Now, a lot of those oxygenated myoglobins, they're probably going to arrive at the mitochondria, but there's no gradient. There's no diffusion gradient, therefore no oxygen ends up passing into the mitochondria. It's already saturated because we're no longer consuming as much. We've got surplus arriving than what we actually need. So they stay there, saturated, ready and waiting for next time. So the slow component, the last thing we're going to be looking at today. So it's this flatter part. So we see this rapid deceleration in our oxygen consumption post-exercise, but it's still slightly elevated. And this could last 24 hours, depending on the intensity of the exercise, the duration of the exercise. If you run the marathon, for example, your slow component is going to remain elevated for probably a little higher and a little longer than if you ran up some stairs. Well, granted, if the stairs you were running up were just one flight, I should have said that. So 2 or 3 minutes of exercise won't have anywhere near as much impact on the body as running a marathon. That's what I should have said. So in the hours that follow exercise, the performer's VO2, the volume of oxygen that they consume or bring in and deliver around the body, will remain slightly elevated. Not massively, we're not huffing and puffing, like we do in the first minute or so after vigorous exercise. If you run a 400-metre race, you're probably bent double or lying on your back, arms up, backwards. You're not like that for 12 hours. You're like that for a minute or so, and then it decreases, and then you go back to normal. But if you were to measure it, this resting volume is going to be slightly higher than what you were prior to exercise to start with. Again, 3 purposes. Lactic acid removal. Now that we've dealt with putting oxygen back into the muscle and resynthesizing ATP and phosphocreatine, now we can turn our attention to longer processes. Lactic acid removal, we start to reoxidize it. We start to introduce oxygen back into our muscle. Lactic acid can now be reconverted to pyruvic acid. Think about anaerobic glycolysis, glycogen, glucose, pyruvic acid, and then lactate dehydrogenase converts it to lactic acid if we haven't got any oxygen. Well, now we do have oxygen. We've got the surplus. So we take the lactic acid, we revert the process, turn it into pyruvic acid, and then break it down further. If anything, lactic acid is just like it's a holding zone for energy. Glycogen, glucose, pyruvic, lactic acid, then we're recovering lactic acid, pyruvic acid, and then we can carry on breaking it down. 2 ATP, Krebs cycle, ETC, 34 ATP. So yes, lactic acid can burn your muscle at the time, but when we're recovering, this lactic acid can be reconverted and almost acts as a fuel source to be broken down and to release the energy. Glycogen replenishment. Obviously, we had at the very start phosphocreatine, glycogen, free fatty acids. Well, we've already sorted out the phosphocreatine. That was in the fast stage in the first 3 minutes. Glycogen can now be replenished. If we are consuming appropriate nutrition, we're starting to increase our intake of carbohydrates. We can start to convert and break that down into glycogen and the smaller, more refined glucose, which we can start to disperse around the body and deliver it to our muscles that we're working. Think about the structural characteristics of muscle fibres. They've got glycogen storage space. Well, if they've been exercising and they've been almost like a petrol tank, they've been burning through and converting glycogen that was originally stored inside the muscle, well, they're running on empty. So now we're eating and consuming fresh batches of glycogen, or we're retrieving it from the liver, or our free fatty acids are being retrieved from our triglycerides and adipose tissue, our fat stores. We start to get these new stores, break them, convert them, deliver them around the body, and store them inside of our muscle fibres that need them. And then, obviously, sustaining the recovery process. Everything I've just described there, lactic acid removal, glycogen consumption, think about our digestive system. If we are in keeping our oxygen elevated, we're breathing more rapidly and deeper, so our respiratory system and respiratory muscles are going to be working. If our heart is working harder to carry on this supply of oxygenated blood around the body, everything's still working. And if everything's working inside the body, well, what does it need to work? Energy. So we carry on consuming oxygen at a higher rate because all of our bodily systems are functioning at a higher rate to help us recover. Now, in that section there as well, sustaining the recovery process, we can also put in protein synthesis. So we start to rebuild any sort of broken down tissue. So, lactic acid removal. Obviously, in that graph there, that high intensity exercise curve, that red curve, the more lactic acid we produce in the movement, the longer it's going to take to get rid of it, to break it down. Or the Cori cycle, as it's also called, where we break down lactic acid, send it to the liver for breakdown. So we accumulate it when we're exercising. So then when we stop exercising and we've got that surplus oxygen, we can begin to break it down, remove it, and get rid. But we need excess oxygen, which goes back to this very title of this section, EPOC, excess, post-exercise, oxygen consumption. Getting rid of lactic acid, take it to the liver, that fourth point there, take it to the liver for breakdown into the glucose, converting it into, helping to produce, our BCAAs, our branched chain amino acids, our proteins. Glycogen replenishment. So we already touched on this. How we're eating foods. Are we eating the right foods? Carbohydrate, nutrient rich, in this sort of 30 to 60 minute window. Don't want to leave it too long, because otherwise, if our EPOCs come down too low and it's gone too far back to resting levels, then we're not going to be able to, access all of these nutrients as quickly or as soon after exercise is finished. It's not the most essential thing, but there is this slight window, this 30 to 60 minute where it's optimal, but it doesn't mean to say that if you eat after that, it's not effective. It's just optimal. But this whole conversion process, breaking down carbohydrates, delivering them around the body, storing them, it takes energy. And where do we get this energy from? We get it from the aerobic pathways. We get it by breaking down fats that are still available. We get it by oxidizing them with surplus oxygen. Hence, we need EPOC. And then, like I'd already said, it's there to sustain the recovery process. It's everything that we've just spoken about. In the slow stage, the fast stage, this return to pre-exercise levels. It takes energy. It takes bodily systems to be functioning at above resting levels. Therefore, it requires above resting energy levels. And where do we get the energy, this exothermic release to fuel these systems? Aerobic pathway. What do we need for aerobic pathways to be open and usable? Oxygen. Which brings us to the end. So, like halfway through, there is a timeout task for you to jump in and do, or give a go. Pause the video or go back through it, completely up to you. But yeah, just a couple of other questions to help hopefully solidify some understanding on this topic. But yeah, they're there as well as the slides, and that is that. So we took a look at muscle fibre types originally and how they're structured differently I should say, to each other, and how that reflects their functionality and their use of different energy systems. Then we had a little look at EPOC and how we consume oxygen post-exercise because of the depth, this deficit that we created at the start. We've got two different components: fast stage, 3 minutes, 3 litres of oxygen, and 3 things happen. ATP resynthesis, phosphocreatine resynthesis, myoglobin resaturation. Then we have the slow component, and this can take 24 hours plus, if need be. It depends on the intensity and duration of the exercise. 3 things happen here. We've got the lactic acid removal, we've got glycogen replenishment, and we've got sustained energy for all of the bodily systems involved with recovery. Protein synthesis, digestion, cardiovascular, respiratory, everything like that. So I hope that was useful. That's been the second lesson in this energy systems unit. I think we've got one more, perhaps two more. So tune in for those as well if you're getting something out of these, which I hope you are. But yeah, I've been Johnny. This has been A-level group classes. I hope that was of use to you in some way, shape or form. If you do want anything else like this, classes, resources, revision, worksheets, PowerPoints, tuition, whatever it might be, head on over to thepetutor.com. There's loads going on over there. But yeah, feel free to reach out anytime. But hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much.